The first time I met Dr. Adam Koontz was about a year ago. He preached at the installation of one of our new circuit pastors. I don't even know if at the time we were introduced to each other, but as I walked out of the church with a fellow circuit pastor, our comments went like this: "Who was that guy? Man, can he preach? That was one of the best sermons I ever heard at an installation. No jokes, no demeaning of the office, no demeaning of the congregation, just straight up 200 proof Lutheranism." So of course I went home and creeped on the then Reverend Koontz on social media and learned that he was the newest professor at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne and a recovering Anglican. I since had the privilege of taking one of his continuing education classes here in St. Cloud. And since I now have at least 20 CEUs from Fort Wayne, I wish you guys would quit giving me grief about graduating from St. Louis. Now to the official seminary bio. Adam Koontz has been on the faculty of Concordia Theological Seminary since the fall of 2019. A 2014 MDiv alumnus, he was the pastor of Mount Calvary, Lidditz, Pennsylvania, and planted Concordia, Myerstown, Pennsylvania. He successfully defended his dissertation on the imitation of Paul in the Greco-Roman world in January of 2020 and was awarded the PhD in religion from Temple University in May of 2020. Born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and raised in a small town in central Pennsylvania on the Appalachian Trail, he met and married his wife Jennifer while an honors major in comparative literature at Swarthmore College outside Philadelphia. He and Jen have 6 children: Christian, Lydia, Isaac, Julia, Paul, and Maria. And if you want to creep on Dr. Koontz, you can read the fall 2019 Issues Etc. journal, which details his road to Wittenberg, or you can listen in on an interview on the same on the Issues Etc. archives. It is my pleasure to welcome Reverend Dr. Adam Koontz.
Thank you, Bruce. It's great to be here with you this afternoon. I'm not just a recovering Anglican, I'm a recovering Episcopalian specifically, so it's as bad as it sounds. Tomorrow morning, you're going to hear a text, probably the first lesson, from a book that I think needs to contribute to how we think about what occurs with the church and the government, and that is from Revelation 14. Some of you know the history of why that's a reading on Reformation Sunday, but apart from that history, which we can go into some other time, it's helpful to think about Revelation in conjunction with some other texts we'll also talk about this afternoon. When we think about government's role and its relationship to the church and a lot of those questions, precisely because Revelation shows you the end of the thing 3 times at the very least. And in showing you the end of the thing, it shows you what is actually wrong with humanity in rebellion, whether humanity is in government or humanity is pursuing its way across the earth, so merchants or all kinds of different occupations and vocations. What is it like when they're in rebellion against God, against their Creator, and what happens when they are judged for those things? And I think something to think about, and I want to think holistically in this presentation, is to think about what is actually the temptation and why do certain governors come in for condemnation in the book of Revelation? I would say it's precisely because they are in revolt against God's natural or created order, nature and creation being really equivalent biblically. Because they're in revolt, what is going on is that they cannot stay their own pride and always overstep the boundary given to them. We're going to spell that out a little bit later in the context of the United States in the present day. But I just want to point out from the beginning that when you read Revelation tomorrow morning, you want to think about why is there this eternal gospel in Revelation 14 that involves fearing God and worshiping only God? Why must that be a message proclaimed throughout time and space to fallen man? It's precisely because our great temptation is not to heed those things and to want to be more than we were made to be. Because I think when you think about this year, you're thinking a little deficiently if you just think about COVID or Wuhan flu or whatever you want to call it. You have to think about also all of the other things that have accelerated or picked up or been publicly proclaimed in a new way this year, not least of all in the state of Minnesota. What you have is a situation in which it feels as if things are increasingly and rather rapidly falling apart. Things once deemed certain, obvious, clear, basic are now anything but. And what was 5 years ago something you probably had never heard of, and if I stood up here and said some of the current buzzwords, some of you would understand and some of you, blessed art thou, would not understand what I was talking about. That's how rapidly not only society, political discussion, but even our own language is changing. And one of the things that you can see in Revelation is that the control of language has immense power. So the words we use to talk about things matter. It also matters that we take a holistic view of what is going on. Because it's not only that in our time and place we have dealt with, unusual restrictions that we've never dealt with before in having church. That is totally part of it. It's also the case that rapidly obvious gender roles have been eclipsed, gone away altogether. People struggle to form families. When they do form families, they struggle to have children. Lots of things are kind of falling apart and falling away. So as we think about sin and the created order and where we go as church going forward, I want to think about it all together. I think that also, and this is my last kind of preliminary thing, that will also prevent us from polarization as much as possible within the church. Because towards the end of the presentation, we're going to look at 1 Peter, and one of the absolute most crucial things about 1 Peter, which I think in some ways is a very helpful letter for us, in some ways more than Romans, because it's specifically in view of suffering. Peter is very clear to address the church as an elect nation, a royal priesthood. That is, they have far more in common with each other, not least a destiny in and because of Christ, than they do with the world. Because when you think about what is going on with the world, it's very easy, and we've seen it, we're seeing it right now with our churches. What is going on is that the world pulls on us in 1,500 different directions in a way that our doctrine doesn't seem to pull us all in the same direction. Our traditional practices don't seem to pull us all in the same direction, and being pulled by the world, we are pulled apart. So that when Peter talks to us, he talks to us as people who, because of our baptism, have, with Noah and his family, been separated from the world, right? You pray when you baptize somebody, kept safe and secure in the holy ark of the Christian church, being separated from the multitude of unbelievers. And that should apply when I think about who or what I am to believe, and therefore do on a Sunday morning or any other day, just as it does when we pray that the kid would be brought back the next Sunday after he's baptized. Right? So let's get going on the main thing here. I want to start with understanding how we think about sin and power, how those two things are related for human beings. Because when you think about sin, it is not only something that affects us on an individual level. I'm tempted to do something wrong. The schematic for it biblically is that, first of all, it is an attempt to become something that I am not. That what we call the fall is a fall precisely because it was an attempt at flight upward into something we were not made to be and are not, essentially, that is God's. It was an attempt to try to be something we are not and never can be. So that the devil's lie is precisely telling us to become unnatural, and the temptation for us was to try to become something beyond our own nature, beyond what we were made to be, beyond what we should be contented with being. So when I think about Genesis 3, that helps me understand when I first start hearing about human power, and we take it because it's historical, therefore precisely it matters for our understanding of who we are. When I look at Nimrod, or later on in Genesis, the Tower of Babel, the significance of those stories is that once I get together or get power over other people, I will now seek to make a name for myself. And that's not an innocent comment on a young man's ambition or something. You know, it will fail and he'll learn his lesson and adjust to life later on as he gets older. Those comments about Nimrod or the builders of the Tower of Babel are there to show what the nature of human ambition is. That is, that it is discontented and desires to have power over others in some sort of common project that will somehow aggrandize the builders. We will get there. We will build something. So that whatever you think the Tower of Babel is, if it resembles an ancient Babylonian ziggurat or not, the evaluation of all pagan religion, which here is combined with united collective effort, the nature of that is to try to become something I am not, and to try to gain something I don't have, a name that doesn't belong to me, maybe of enduring fame. Now, when I go to later discussions of government, this is very helpful to remember. Especially government in a society not controlled by someone who even owes the allegiance of the mouth, not of the heart, but just lip service to the gospel. Because when you're looking at the history of Israel and Judah, lip service is owed to the Lord and his promises and some version of his temple system. It's perverted, to be sure. They lose the scriptures for sure, but it's sort of a church story. Once they go into exile, it becomes something else. So that when I get to Daniel, the help of Daniel is not to look at Daniel and wait and see, okay, well, I'm not surrounded by lions, so I guess everything's good to go. One thing to understand that's significant about Daniel is that the erection of a statue is an erection of something, it's a man. No man is actually physically made to be that tall. There's already a sort of lie inherent in how the idolatry itself has been presented. And now what I'm being asked to do when the music sounds with that list of musical instruments Daniel has is that I need to obey what the collective group is doing, and I need to do it when I am told to do it. And as I am told to do that, it's not only that I'm doing it with other people, but that we all collectively and simultaneously give assent to the lie inherent in idolatry, which is that someone who is not a god should be worshipped, should be treated as a god. It's a revolt against natural order. It's a revolt against creation, and I have to go along with it. Now, Daniel does not, you know those stories. The three young men do not, and their confidence is vindicated by the appearance of one like a son of God in the fire with them. But in not going along with it, it's not simply that Daniel is stubborn. I think sometimes we reduce discussions of obedience to any kind of authority or any kind of order to mere matters of psychology. So if you think I should be more obedient, it's a psychological problem, I'm just being immature. Or if I think that you should be less obedient, it's also a psychological problem, and you need to just kind of get over your infantile obsession with, mommy and daddy's orders. Start thinking for yourself. It's really not helpful, and we don't give a sense of Daniel's psychology. It doesn't say Daniel was ornery his whole life and just didn't like to listen to people. It also doesn't say that Daniel was super obedient and the conflict inside him was horrible. What it says instead is that what were Daniel's actions? By their fruits shall you know them. By what he does, you understand what he teaches and believes. And his actions mean that there is a distinction, finally, between divine law and human law. Daniel is otherwise an extremely obedient person, helpful even, doing what Jeremiah commends in exile, which is that he seeks the welfare of the city. Even though the city doesn't agree with him and the city does not worship the only true God, he seeks its welfare. He is immensely helpful, just like Joseph in Egypt. Nevertheless, there is a distinction, there is a time when a distinction must be made, becomes blindingly apparent. It's not really an accident, therefore, that Daniel and Revelation, which fascinate so many American Christians for all sorts of sometimes quite bad reasons, but it's not really a coincidence that Daniel and Revelation are both about times in which the church, before the Messiah's coming or after, is under threat and potentially even of not surviving. And that power proceeds from government. It's not because government is inherently evil. There would be some government of the earth even before the fall. You will have dominion over the earth. Order, rule, hierarchy are not per se bad. If you had a good dad, you know that, at least abstractly. The issue is that government is uniquely capable, because of what it does, because it does bear a sword, to effect evil on the earth and to threaten the church's survival. It's capable in a way that no other created order is really capable of doing, because it does not have nearly so much power. Power is not in and of itself bad, nor is violence. They are bad when used for evil purposes. That's why when you get descriptions of government, and I'll go back to Daniel in a second, but think about Romans 13 in this regard. You'll hear an echo of it in 1 Peter as well. When you think about Romans 13, one of the things that Paul is doing is marking off the limits of government. What is government actually there for? Because in Paul's own time, government claims much greater power than Paul will ascribe to it, including powers of, in certain places, especially in the eastern part of the empire, divinity. Caesar is worshipped as a god, as others had been before him. In saying that government is there to punish wickedness and reward righteousness, or in Peter's words, to punish evildoers and praise those who do good, they are delimiting what government is for, not allowing us to be dominated by somebody who's going to make a 40-foot tall statue of himself and command worship, command assent to a lie. But it is helpful to see that precisely because there is so much power in government, indeed divinely given power to kill, because of that, government is a much more fearsome task and a terrifying order when used for ill. So when you think about Daniel's opposition, the opposition there is between, finally, righteousness and idolatry, between belief and unbelief. And that bright line, which is not marked off and really cannot be marked off by the government, that bright line is marked off only by the preaching of the gospel, whether the person believes or does not. That bright line is finally the one that matters. And that should give us hope. Because Daniel's hope, or you can think about the answer of the three young men, is not that they will finally even survive. It's not even what they claim. Think about what the three young men say. Even if we do not survive the ordeal through which you are putting us, we will not worship false gods, full stop, because the bright dividing line running through all of history is the line between belief and unbelief. Let's say this as we transition to 1 Peter. When we're talking about rebellion against created order, that means that because I am in Christ, my status, because I do have the Holy Spirit, I have been born anew of water and the Spirit, I have a different relationship to God's created orders than I did before. Before, perhaps I was in revolt against a variety of them. That's why I asked you, in thinking about the present moment, about this crazy year, to think holistically. Because you have to think about a society in which it's not only the case that the church and the state aren't really sure how they're relating to each other anymore, as we undergo rapid historic change and enormous amounts of de-Christianization, which hit things like the Episcopal Church faster and harder because of its unfaithfulness, but it's hitting us now too. We bury people, and maybe the kids go to church, the grandkids probably, statistically, don't. Maybe they even have begun to practice some other sort of a religion, which the internet makes it possible for people that formerly would not have known each other's practice of Wicca or something to be in contact with each other. So we're also undergoing the things that we have observed over the past 40 or 50 years in mainline Protestantism. It hits everybody now, and all of it happening simultaneously. When you think about these orders, you then realize that it's not simply what is the proper role of the state or what is the proper role of the church or who gets to say when and where and how the doors will be open that is controverted. It's also controverted what a woman is, let alone whether or not she should have children or should have a family, or what economic decisions that family will make for its own well-being. What is the goal of having a family? Do you need to have one? That is far more fundamental in the lives of children who now, in addition to those questions being up in the air in their own lives, maybe their parents are treating their gender as unassigned for the time being. Now they have to go to school and sit, effectively, some of these poor kids inside a literal bubble. Life with so much confusion about things that biblically are created givens is, in fact, miserable. So psychology is not necessarily a good way to decide how we should react to people, but reports of endemic depression and loneliness and anxiety, especially the younger the demographic goes in America, are, I don't think, to be altogether neglected. It's something to pay attention to. Why are we, and why especially are people who have basically their entire lives in front of them so sad? Because the prognosis for any order that is in revolt against God's creation is very, very, very bad. You can think about kings driven mad and eating grass like the beasts of the field. You can think about Pharaoh drowned with his host in the Red Sea. Those are examples of governors who thought that they were immortal or godlike or any host of other things could, for a very long time, thwart the divine will and survive and flourish. And none of that, in fact, came to pass. But realize that that dynamic of frustrated revolt and its consequences does not only go on inside government. It goes on inside the home. It goes on inside the church. It goes on inside any realm of human life in which we would push and push and push and push against what we or some group of people were made to be. So a Christian is somebody who loves God's orders. He is not saved thereby. No one, I think, has ever preached that the table of duties in the small catechism was salvation. But he loves to live in them because they come from his God who has redeemed him. He loves to live in them because those are precisely the places that the Holy Spirit has driven him to live out the life of the Spirit which has been given to him in baptism. He loves to be there. And depending on what he is, he loves to serve in the ways given him to serve. So the table of duties is a wholesome thing. It is the life we have, which we live by faith in the Son of God. And it's comprehensive, making it no surprise that if we disagree about what the home should be like, or how the church should be structured, how pastors and hearers should relate to each other, or how husbands and wives and children should relate to each other, it is then no surprise that the church is also riven with dissension about how the church should relate to the state. if we weren't sure what we were supposed to be doing here in the areas of life closest to us, remaining even in lockdown, then how much more would we have dissension about the areas of life farthest away from many of our understandings? I don't know if I'm unique in this regard, but I knew basically nothing about public health authorities before this year. I had never looked into public health authorities or how many tiers of them there are, or how they do or don't or refuse to relate to one another, or what the sheriff will take responsibility for vis-a-vis the health department. I didn't know any of this stuff. So if I don't understand that, but I also am not heeding God's counsel and wisdom inside my marriage or how I raise my children, how could I hope to come to any kind of lasting or helpful, holistic conclusion for the church's sake about all this stuff that I knew nothing about before March? So I love those orders, and that's precisely where Peter puts us when he talks about government. Because the word that he uses is, I don't like to do this, and I tell the students not to do this in sermons, but it's not a sermon, so let me be a little nitpicky about how the English translations are sometimes bad on 1 Peter 2:13. The word that they're bad on is the command at the very beginning of the verse. Many English translations will render this submit, sometimes obey. There's a better word that expresses the Greek word, which is subordinate. Now, that's kind of a weird verb. We don't tell people to subordinate themselves. I've never once told any of my children, subordinate yourself to me. I should try, maybe. That would be biblical. But what Peter's trying to express is that there's a Greek noun inside that word, inside its stem, and that is taxis, T-A-X-I-S, if you want to transliterate it, and then you can look it up. But that's the idea that there is an order to things, that things are set up in a certain way, and not, therefore, in another way. Paul, in his characteristic way, will refer to these things somewhat obliquely. So when he's talking about gender roles, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, he'll give some sense that there's an order, or does not nature itself teach you that it is a shame for a man to have long hair? It's the same nature he's referring to in Romans 1, talking about homosexuality. But this sense of an order as a given for various realms of life is obvious. And something you can find throughout 1 Peter is an orientation towards those orders. Whenever Peter's giving practical advice about how I go through daily life, we're going to leave suffering for the end of the presentation. That's his other, I think, big theme. But as I go through daily life, how do I conduct myself? What do I do? I'm going to orient myself through those orders. Basically, I'm going to figure out, what is my job? And significantly, even within the same order, let's say the family, you don't have the same verbs, right? Ephesians 5 is probably the most familiar to you here, so think about it this way. The husband is commanded to love the wife is commanded to submit, or really subordinate, to the husband. But the husband is not commanded to ensure that the wife will do it, nor is the wife commanded to ensure that the husband will do his job. We all have our own jobs according to our given nature, according to how God has made us. And in doing that, and in commending that, not simply because it was made that way, but because that's also how the regenerate live, in doing that, we're expressing the goodness of those things, that they're good, that they're wholesome, that this is how life should be as much as is possible. And in marriage, you're talking about something that was there before the fall and amazingly and blessedly continues to exist. So they're good things. So Peter says, subordinate, put yourself in order under, as a soldier would in falling into the ranks. Subordinate yourself to every human creature or creation. Kitise is an ambiguous word, but you do this on account of the Lord. Why? The Lord himself is one who subordinated himself to his Father's will in achieving my salvation. So there is no salvation available to me unless my Lord himself had subordinated himself to the Father's will. You can see here something that's, when Luther talks about doctrine, he says it's all a point. It's a mathematical point. Everything is connected. So if I want to revolt against order or against subordination in life, against falling into the task given me based on who I am, then I'm also going to end up revolting against the gospel. For the sake of the Lord, you do this. Now, in calling these powers, let's say in Romans' words, in calling these powers human creatures or human creations, Peter is being clear that they are not what many claim they are and what they themselves will sometimes claim they are, which is divine. They are not nearly so obvious or so powerful nor immortal as they claim to be. So on account of the Lord, therefore, not on really their own account, but on account of the Lord, I will subordinate myself to them. He then mentions the basileus, which is the Greek word for a Caesar, and then hegemosin, which are people who have hegemony, they have power. It's popularly understood as governors. Let's notice this. When Peter talks about government, he doesn't talk generically. He talks in terms of the governmental system available in his time and place. He would have used a slightly different word, and maybe if he were speaking to people in, say, Britain, which was often functionally governed by the military, he could have spoken more specifically because he's dealing with people in the East. He speaks in the ways that he does Caesar and those whom he sends. Peter here is being actually sort of brutally honest because at the time they still theoretically believe that the Senate sends certain people and others are sent by Caesar. Peter knows what the real story is, which is Caesar's in charge of everything. The Senate is completely irrelevant by this point. And so all you have to pay attention to is what's actually happening. So Caesar and the governors whom he sends. That's important to remember when we're talking about order in the American context, because I think a lot of times when you go directly from the New Testament or you go directly from Luther, you forget that different governmental systems obtain in different times and places. Therefore, the order is different. So if in the United States you have a distinction between what a sheriff can do and what the governor can do and what the president of the United States can do, to disobey one level may not be to not subordinate yourself, because the thing has always been set up, as Anglo-Saxon government has always been set up, as a mixed order with mixed powers. Separation of powers and checks and balances is not only something that in 1787 someone thought of for the first time, it's something that has been in the nature of Anglo-Saxon government really from before the Norman conquest. Think about the idea of having a jury. You're being accused by lots of people. They've hunted you down. It's come to a trial. These local people, a jury of your peers, can decide the case. Not all power resides in any one sort of food chain of power, as it did certainly in New Testament times within the imperial system, with allowances for the fact that, in Britain, it's really far away from Rome, so you can do more of what you want, etc. Functionally, that's a much more obviously and straightforwardly hierarchical governmental system in a way that ours is not. Ours has always been, even prior to our formation as a nation, differentiated power. Different levels have different powers. There's more to say on that, and I'll say it at the end when I talk about application. But notice that he really is attentive to how government functions in his own day, not simply what's on paper, because then he would have talked about the Senate. Government is not sent to do anything other than this. It's sent for the punishment of those who do evil and the praise of those who do well. Now, this is God's will, Peter explains, precisely because Peter does not want Christians to suffer for the wrong reasons. So Peter can be almost humorous later on in the letter when he says, when you do something evil and you get punished for it, what's the problem here? That's precisely what government is for. Now, suffering we'll talk about at the end, but when you do evil, that's what they're there to punish. That's precisely what they're there to do. They're there to protect innocence and to protect life and to punish wickedness and to punish murder. Okay. We have a little bit more to say about 1 Peter and then some recommendations going forward. Before I do that, I think it's important to reflect in this way, I hope holistically, not only on the government, but that is that when a government, for instance, kills unborn children in a way far more of an epidemic of destruction than anything that I think any virus, whether the swine flu or SARS-1, which is probably the one that's most virologically similar to what's now called COVID, but was originally SARS-2. The World Health Organization renamed it at one point. When you think about a government that not only allows it to happen, but actually has protected it over the years, Planned Parenthood v. Casey in the early 90s strengthened the force of abortion, and precisely the reason that judicial confirmations are the fight that they are is, I think, partly because you are required to offer some sort of obeisance to the idea that you won't overturn Roe v. Wade. And if you won't offer said obeisance, the dogma lives too loudly within you, at least if you are a professing Christian. So when you think about what is actually going on, both what is on the books and legally protected by Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, but also what preceded that, the right to privacy was actually invented in a case, Griswold v. Connecticut, in 1965, which was actually about contraception, access for married couples to contraception. When you think about a history of striving against life, innocent life in the case of abortion, you realize that our government permits these things. This has been going on for a very, very, very long time. Dozens of millions of Americans dead because of it. Dozens of millions. I mean, far more even, I think, than the number of Soviets that died in the Second World War. When you think about it that way, you realize that we're not simply dealing with a case of some sort of neutral party that is adjudicating things rationally and neutrally. You're dealing with something that is now fundamentally in revolt against its creator. That doesn't mean that I have absolutely no respect for it. Think about the case of parents. Luther says in the Large Catechism, parents are so valuable, even if I had none, I would have to set up wood and stone and honor them as my parents. A bad father or a bad mother is still a father or a mother and is therefore to be respected. That doesn't mean that I ignore the fact that he's a bad father or she's a bad mother, and it doesn't mean that I therefore behave as if he's always been wonderful and will be, or she's always been so loving and kind, and of course will be in the future. When Jesus commands us to be wise as serpents, I believe that he wants us to pay attention not only to what is on the books, but also what is practically going on and has gone on, what the history has been, and therefore what the future might be in order to orient our conduct. So take a look at the verbs in verse 17 in chapter 2. They're not all given, I think, equally well in every translation, but if it's helpful, there are 4 of them, and the first and the last should both be translated honor. Give honor to everyone and to Caesar, or the emperor, or the king, depending on how you want to translate that last noun. Significance of that is that everyone has some kind of honor, not only Caesar. It's not only Caesar for whom I should hold open doors or be kind and respectful and use a title where a title is needed. So you can also see that, I don't think that disrespect for all forms of government is actually inherent in the American character or American history. You can talk about a lot of different history. I think a lot of the disrespect for government and its role is born out of a larger disrespect for roles, titles, and given orders of life that are actually good and helpful, like, say, getting dressed when you go out in public. And I don't say this to be curmudgeonly. I think that's actually a sign that people, when they go out in public, do not respect each other in the same way that they did when they had to do more work to appear to one another in public. So when you think about the notion of honor here, the honor is that I treat you with respect at all times and in all places, as is your due. Of course, I'm going to do that for Caesar as well, but I do it for everyone. I honor you. Okay. Two other verbs. One is that fear is rendered only to God. That's the third phrase, fear God. You are not meant to be, you are not made to be in fear of Caesar. Right? Think about Jesus' admonition to his disciples, do not fear those who can kill the body. Fear is finally only due to God. I can go into the furnace if they're going to throw me in there because my fear is only of God, not of what will happen to my body or what they'll be able to do to it. And to jump into talking about the future, I think the second verb is the most important one for us, for right now. And that is love. And the love is of what Peter calls the brotherhood. Now, he has spoken of us already in this letter as a priestly kingdom, a royal priesthood, etc., an elect nation. Here he calls us the brotherhood. Love the brotherhood. Sometimes it gets kind of morphed into love the brothers, which I think is too specific. The brotherhood functions in this way, that it is an order that has nothing to do with Caesar. It is an order that has nothing to do with the public health authorities, it's not commanded by them, it's not brought into existence by them. It comes from the fact that we call God our Father who art in heaven. It's the fact that we are adopted by God's grace into a family that we did not choose to belong to, but which it is our privilege to belong to, the brotherhood. And when you think about brotherhood in ancient history, brotherhoods are precisely those things that can endure in difficult times because the bonds are not destroyed even by civil war or social collapse. A brotherhood can survive the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Roman state, however, cannot, or a tax collector, or any of the other things that you might enter into in life. Once the Romans disappeared, by and large, functionally in the Mediterranean, the pirates came back. So if I'm a merchant, I'm going to have problems now. Brotherhood does not rely on the state to exist. Love the brotherhood. Let me focus on the verb before we say anything more. The verb means that, and if you have the Greek, you're able to understand it. It's the Greek word that is specifically not the word for friendship or the word for erotic love. It's the kind of love that God has for mankind for the sake of his son Christ. So it's love which is always seeking the good, the joy, the peace of the other. The thing that I was most concerned about with church closure and remain concerned was not how everyone was handling completely new situations. We should obviously exercise massive charity with each other, especially when no one has ever done this before. No one's ever been in 2020 before. The concern that I have is the effect that it has on the unity of the church, even among people who formerly had absolutely no reason for dissension with one another. Some of it not really reducible to, and therefore I don't think solved by, the election that's going to happen in a few days, or any sort of political opinion or media intake. That's probably part of the cause of the dissension, the vastly fragmented media market that we all live inside, taking what appears obvious and accustomed to us and leaving the rest or not even being aware of it. But it's also the case that what has been created among the brotherhood is a sense that the problem for us is the brother who does or does not wear a mask, who is or is not distancing enough for our comfort or to bring our comfort back, will not get close enough to us, and the lack of charity and judgmentalism which is endemic in these situations. And it has created this situation in every single congregation in the United States. Maybe, I'd be happy to be corrected after the presentation, maybe you have no one where you attend or where you pastor who is having a problem with any of this, and you're right straight back up to the Sunday numbers that you had February, 7th. That's wonderful, especially if there's no dissension about any of it. But I would be I would hazard a guess that we all have these problems now, where we work, where we worship, maybe even where we live, that it has sown enormous division, maybe enduring division. I know there are people who may never come back to church in all kinds of congregations. And unfortunately, and as a former mainline Protestant, my view of them is a little bit maybe different. I don't look at them as, of course, this Episcopal church down the street from me is closed for 2 years, which it is. But what happened to Christ and his word in this place that they are willing, maybe never, to come back together? What happened? Because I think the end result of this dissension is finally the destruction of the gospel, potentially, certainly in the lives of certain people who now don't feel safe even hearing it. Some recommendations going forward. One is that we respect the orders that we have been given and subordinate ourselves to them. What do I mean by that? I mean that we grasp not only that government commands, but what the nature of government is among us. I think if we continue to think of ourselves as completely passive, constantly forced into a corner, without any recourse within a Republican form of government to any change, any discussion, any protest, our churches will be forced to stay closed, even as peaceful protests, quote unquote, go on in the streets without any of the things that the church is so worried about obeying, and is in fact permitted to destroy entire core areas of our major cities, while the church is concerned about how to obey and fighting with each other, destroying each other, biting and devouring one another over directives issued by people who could care less about the gospel. So when we think about the future, I would prioritize the brotherhood as I subordinate myself to government. Government is good, but the contrast drawn in the New Testament is not that a domineering form of government always grasping more and more power as its budgets grow, especially since the Second World War, not a libertarian conspiracy theory, but plain historical fact. Maybe that government is not functioning the way it is supposed to. Maybe it was set up otherwise. Maybe as a voter in a Republican form of government in a country with an Anglo-Saxon system of law, I can do something about it, maybe. So that biting and devouring my fellow church members is a waste of my time when I could actually do something about what is going on in the government. And that would be good. That would be to respect the order that was actually erected by our forefathers. It isn't as if everyone who issues directives knows or understands the national or your state constitution or their interpretation, or as if the federal constitution sets it up the way it's actually been functioning. Certainly for the past 50 years, the judges get to decide absolutely everything. Maybe it wasn't set up that way. And if you want to respect the order that does obtain in your nation, you should do something about that. Because biblically, I think it's rather obvious that the natural tendency of any group of human beings, whether they're Lutherans or Muslims or nothing at all in particular, when they get power is to seek to take more of it. So that you don't need to wait to collectively organize or to love the brotherhood before all other things. You don't have to wait until you are forced into a completely desperate political or social situation, where in fact assembling is forbidden indefinitely without any recourse or discussion. You don't have to wait for that. You don't have to wait to be thrown into the lion's den in order to discuss persecution and why and how the church ought to exist going forward. That is, biblically, we are not to be filled with a spirit of constant accommodation, but of power and love and self-control. And that these orders, whether they are the church or the family, are also to be respected by the state. The state cannot bring the brotherhood into existence, and it cannot write it out of existence. The state cannot actually define, although it should, and it should do better at it. But since God has made man and woman as he has made them, just because the state is confused about the words marriage, man, woman, etc., does not thereby abolish them. Man cannot actually destroy what God has made. He can pervert it, he can warp it, he can turn it toward darkness. He cannot destroy it. And that gives us hope for the future. Because attention not only to public health directives, but to how we love one another within the church, or how husbands love wives, or wives submit to husbands, or how fathers raise children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, will become more important than ever. We now have no help from anyone around us. Our children are bombarded with every message to the contrary, seeking to destroy the orders that God has set up, which are made for our flourishing and our blessing. So we will devote ourselves all the more intently to those things, to those orders, to that family, to that congregation, to that nation. We cannot expect to do all of this while also foregoing suffering. When Peter talks about suffering as a Christian, he sees it as a natural outcome of living in a world which is already passing away, a world in which the authorities are deluded about what sort of powers and capabilities they have, a world in which men do not want their responsibilities and women do not want theirs, a world in which the children revolt against the parents and call what the parents taught them in Sunday school and confirmation class and church on Sunday evil and racist and bigoted. We have to defend those things. No one else will. We have to speak for the innocent and the unborn. No one else will, and the state will allow it to continue unless someone does something about it. This is not revolt. This is honor, doing honor to all, especially to the unborn and to the least, the children who now have to spend their entire day staring at a screen. This is honor to them. This is good for them. This will be helpful to them when the church may be the last place in our society that honors God's created orders. Because going forward and looking forward, I am hopeful. I am tremendously hopeful because I know two things. One is that evil comes to an end. Babylon does fall, either before Jesus' return or at his return, when it will be forced to acknowledge his supreme and sole authority in heaven and on earth. They will be forced to say they were wrong, and he will vindicate his people and his truth. So I have none of the confidence that they do, that they can keep going with the propagation and the mandate to lie, that a man can be a woman, that a child is not innocent, and on and on and on. Who knows where it will stop, but we know that it will. So I am hopeful that God will vindicate his truth. Therefore, I'm also hopeful that he will vindicate his people, and that the suffering and the confusion and even the dissension, which I lament, all of these things will work together for good, that it is meant by Satan and evil men for evil, and it is doing evil to us, but it will redound to our good. It will redound to the salvation of God's people. It will redound to the conviction to preach the gospel to every creature. I do think that's in the Bible, so I'm happy to say that. It will redound to Christ's glory and honor. I believe that he will use 2020 even for good, even this. All of it will be good. Not because I'm optimistic about human beings or necessarily the coherence of the Minneapolis city government or anything that we've seen mightily shaken this year, but because I am convinced that he will vindicate his people as he has promised, that his gospel is in fact eternal, so that we can say with Paul that we know in whom we have believed, and we know that he works all things together for good for those who love him, who are called an elect nation, who are called according to his purpose. To him is all glory, now and forever. Amen. Do you want to do questions, Bruce? That's good. Yep, sounds good.
I think we'll take our break now and then return to ask questions of all the presenters today. So it's 2:15. Let's be back here by 2:25. 10 minutes.